Welcome to the Defining Moments podcast. I'm Rabbi David Fine. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists hunted Jews house to house, burned families alive, and committed atrocities that immediately evoked memories of the darkest chapter in Jewish history, the Holocaust. While the systematic Nazi genocide remains uniquely incomparable in its scope and horror, the echoes of that period have haunted our collective consciousness since October 7th. Now, as we've just marked Asarah B'Tevet and the Yom HaKadish HaKlali and approach the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz and International Holocaust Remembrance Day, the weight of these historical parallels feels particularly profound. My guest today is Shifra Malina Waxman, a Holocaust educator and experienced guide in Poland, who has dedicated her life to Holocaust education and memory. In the wake of October 7th, we find ourselves asking profound questions about the meaning of never again in a world where Jews were once again hunted in their homes. How do we process the similarities and differences between these events? And how might this change the way we teach about and remember the Holocaust? These are some of the complex questions we'll explore today with someone who brings both scholarly expertise and deeply personal perspective as an Israeli, a mother of soldiers, and a guardian of Holocaust memory. At this crucial moment in Jewish history, her insights are more relevant than ever. Okay, welcome to the Defining Moments podcast. I'm Rabbi David Fine, and today I'm very honored to host here Shifra Malina Waxman. So before we get into questions or any interview, Shifi, thanks so much for coming. Thanks for being here and taking your time. Why don't you just give us a little bit of a bio of who you are before we start?
Thank you so much for having me. Who am I? My first time around the base is as a career. I was an attorney. When we made Aliyah, that took a back seat for a while. I did a lot of laundry, and then I did a course, and I became a guide in Yad Vashem. And as I became more and more entrenched in that world, I went back to school in Haifa and got my master's in Holocaust studies. Then during COVID, things got quiet in the museum, and so I started to teach classes. I took a course to be a guide in Poland, and I've been doing all of those things for quite a number of years now.
Why would you move from being a lawyer, especially in Israel? Being a lawyer sounds much more lucrative than being a Holocaust educator. So.
The truth is that it wasn't from nowhere. When I was in college, I took quite a number of courses in advanced Yiddish, and I was thinking of going for a graduate degree in Yiddish. And then when I got into law school, my dad said to me, Shifi, you got into law school, you're going to law school. And that's where I started. But it was a love which I returned to, and which I'm happy to say my father was very happy with the switch later on.
Okay, so we'll talk about your legal career another time. We're really here to talk about your Holocaust career and about the Holocaust. The timing is very, very important because we just marked Asarah B'Tevet last week on Friday, which Asarah B'Tevet, for those of you who don't know, is also the day that the Rabbanut, the Israeli rabbinate, chief rabbinate, in the early days of the state, in the early 50s, established as a day that's called Yom HaKadish HaKlali, a day that people, when they don't know the day of death, say Kaddish for people for their relatives who perished in the Holocaust. And pretty soon we're coming up to January 27th, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is also the liberation from Auschwitz. And it's very, very meaningful this year, especially because it's 80 years. It marks 80 years. So the Holocaust is in the air. And really what I want to talk about is the Holocaust through the prism of October 7th. There's a lot to talk about, and we'll also do it in the reverse direction, hopefully if we have time at the end. But let's start with a very seemingly simple question. As somebody who is a Holocaust educator, right, I know just from our own conversations as well as from classes that you teach, part of which I attend, that you've been very hesitant to speak about October 7th, which to me and to others perhaps is a little strange, meaning right after October 7th it wasn't long until people started saying that today, October 7th, is the deadliest day for Jews that have been attacked since the Holocaust. Very soon after that, we saw Gilad Erdan, who is the ambassador to the UN from Israel, or at least at that point he was wearing, a yellow band in the United Nations. So the comparison started right away. Now we'll talk in a moment about whether the comparisons are in place, but why were you hesitant to really talk about it?
Well, first, I think that's a good characterization. I have been hesitant, and we've discussed it many times. First of all, it feels like an open wound. And there was a while when it was just too heavy to link the two. We're still living in the midst of history. History is still unfolding around us. And it seemed a little bit early to already be drawing conclusions between what's happening right now in our newspaper cycle, in our news cycle, to things that happened 80 years ago and even further back. So that was the first hesitation. The other hesitation is that a bedrock of Holocaust education is the unique nature of the Holocaust. And oftentimes when Holocaust imagery and Holocaust symbols are being applied to other circumstances, we view it as dilution. We view it as a misuse of the Holocaust and its memory, and it feels uncomfortable. Nonetheless, with time, I think that I've come around a little bit, and I feel more comfortable to talk about it. That's our conversation today. I feel more comfortable, and I've reviewed my thoughts the following way. First of all, I've thought a lot about the Vehisha Amda that we say on Pesach. And in that sense, the notion of putting Jewish tragedy within the context of overall Jewish history is a very natural thing to do. And so to the extent that we want to look at October 7th and look at it within the overall scope of throughout history, the terrible things have befallen the Jewish people, that's not something which is antithetical to the way that we look at our history as Jews. And then the other piece of it is that I heard Chavi Dreyfus address the fact that comparing and contrasting is something that historians do all the time. And so the fact that we are drawing areas where October 7th and the Shoah have certain commonalities and in many ways trigger us to think of one or the other, that's a very natural thing. It doesn't mean that they're similar on all realms. The Holocaust was part of World War II. There are many, many differences, far more differences than similarities between the two events. And yet, there are things which those of us who went through and as you just said, just immediately after the event, the Holocaust comparisons and the feelings of remembering the Holocaust immediately came up to the fore and were being discussed everywhere.
So just for those who may not know, Chavi Dreyfus is?
She's a professor at Tel Aviv University, a very preeminent professor of the Holocaust.
Now, you said a few moments ago that a bedrock of Holocaust education is the uniqueness of the Holocaust and really an inability to compare it to anything else, any other tragedy in Jewish history.
Or not in Jewish history, any other genocides that may happen to in other times in history.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Yeah. But when you say the bedrock, does everyone agree with that?
I think that it's within the world of scholars and historians. I think that it's understood that other things can be compared, as I just said. In other words, we're always involved in these comparisons. We compare the experiences of Western European Jews in the Holocaust and Eastern European Jews in the Holocaust. We compare what happened in genocides in Darfur and what happened in the Holocaust. We compare. But that's not the same as equalize. Right. And when we speak about the Shoah, I think that we do try to hold on to the fact that what the Nazis did to the Jews during the Shoah is unique in history and remains that way.
So just to summarize, or conclude, if I understand correctly, you therefore would be against somebody like Erdan wearing a yellow band or people wearing, uniforms from a concentration camp.
I recoiled when I saw that image. I distinguish Gilad Erdan from those who were survivors and those who were down in the Gaza envelope. In other words, if you were down there, like anyone who has suffered on your basar, on yourself, I give you full range to express that however you find meaning to do so. I think that its use by politicians is not so wise. I again recoil when people refer to Hamasnikim as Nazim. The Nazim were plenty bad and the Hamasnikim are plenty bad. There's no need, I think, to name one the other. They can each stand in their own pantheon of evil.
Okay, we'll get back to this topic. I want to talk about something else for a moment. You're very entrenched, like we said at the beginning, in Holocaust education. So I want to talk a little bit about Holocaust education, especially as it happens here in Israel. So we know that there's a very famous statement sent by Santayana, right? He said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And we've spent decades teaching about the Holocaust in classrooms, in concentration camps. We've heard for decades, never again. And yet, on October 7th, Jews were hunted from house to house while the entire world watched. So this forces us to ask, really, what are the goals of Holocaust education? And if the main goal is preventing these things from repeating itself, then clearly something isn't working. So what are the goals of Holocaust education, and what needs to change in order to make never again not just a slogan?
Okay, so it's really a two-part question, and I'll answer it in two parts. The first has to do with a general, and I would say it's almost a philosophical question of what's the point of, or what are our goals with Holocaust education. And again, this is something we've discussed in the past, that when one teaches the Holocaust, there's this tension between wanting not to over-editorialize or to force the events of the Holocaust to fit a certain message. We often joke about the Parshat HaShavua that can be melded to fit any kind of message. And so I think it's important, and a lot of times Holocaust education is cherry-picked, and they'll take certain events, and it'll be meant to teach a lesson of the importance of democracy, of the importance of Zionism, of a whole range of different lessons can be squeezed out of the Holocaust. And what happens is that this editorialization sometimes feels a little bit unfair or not fully in line with the historical facts. And it's something which I try to shy away from. And at the same time, you can't just in Holocaust education throw a load of facts. You do have to somehow string them together to make a cogent sort of lesson. It's somewhere between being totally agnostic and just throwing a Wikipedia of these are the things that happened. And on the other hand, not forcing them into a certain lesson that seems to limit the truth of what actually happened. That's a tension that's always happening in Holocaust education. Holocaust education, sorry, did you want to say something?
No, maybe you're going to answer what I wanted to ask in the second part of the question.
Okay,
right?
no.
Second part of the answer.
So that issue is, what is the point of Holocaust education? I think it's meant to be many things. It's meant to teach all of those things. The importance of treating everybody fairly, the importance of being aware to the threats posed by anti-Semitism, the importance, I'm a Zionist, it's the importance of the safety of the state of Israel. It's the importance to intervene as the Chasidei Umot Olam, as the righteous Gentiles did when people outside your group are suffering. There are many, many lessons that are there. As far as why it hasn't been successful in preventing what happened in October 7th, and I'd say even more so, there was this terrible insult that it was flipped on us. In other words, not only were the lessons of the Holocaust not heeded to in protecting Jewish people, but very quickly you saw the slogans and the verbiage and the images of the Holocaust being flipped on their heads, and the Jews were being called Nazis. And in that sense, it was this terrible injustice. How did that happen? The best that I can say is that anti-Semitism goes back to Esav Soneh Yaakov, that there is a scourge of anti-Semitism which is going to exist. And perhaps that's just the way of the world. I think that we have to recognize that if someone has an irrational hatred of the Jewish people, that it's not going to be cured, if you will, by education. And that was the case in Germany, and that is the case in certain extreme Islamist anti-Semitic doctrines. And it's a hatred which is illogical and is beyond education.
Thank you. But in the beginning of the second part of your
Yes.
answer, with that list of all the things, all the things that we want to accomplish in Holocaust education, it's interesting to me that making sure it doesn't happen again was not on that list, which leads me to a second part of the question, which is, okay, let's say that I want to make sure that it doesn't ever happen again. What is the average person in the street? What is David Fine able to do in order to make sure that the Holocaust or some tragedy like this never happens again? And in all reality, the whole list that you gave, is the regular person, average person in the street able to prevent the scourge of anti-Semitism? What can the average person do? And at the end of the day, what are we really, really trying to accomplish in terms of an action item? Okay, we could say that it's in order to recognize anti-Semitism, but that's not an action item. What can we do with Holocaust education that will really make the world a better place? Or maybe there isn't anything.
Well, to a certain extent, your questions are above my pay grade. But having said that, I think that there has been a trend over the last couple decades where Holocaust education has become reduced to certain slogans and has become somewhat detached from the original anti-Semitism. In other words, discussing anti-Semitism hasn't always been the foremost center of discussing what happened to the Jews, and rather it becomes reduced to certain ideas of being nice to everyone, etc. I think that perhaps a real in-depth discussion of anti-Semitism could be helpful. In other words, understanding what irrational hatred of Jews is, what it means to have a different standard for the state of Israel than any other country in the world, what that is and what that means and what that looks like. Whether I have an action item for you and I for tomorrow, I'm not sure. But I think that keeping an understanding that the Holocaust wasn't only about social psychology and pressure of groups, it was all about, at its core, hatred of Jews.
When you talk about having a serious conversation about anti-Semitism, I'm not sure who you mean should have that conversation. Should it be amongst ourselves, the Jewish people, about what we could do to prevent it? Or perhaps more importantly, amongst the other nations of the world, that many of them have helped to, bring it about even further?
I don't know. I tend to think micro in my life. And so I think that it's an important conversation for us to have amongst ourselves so that we're aware of the threats which we face. Very often the biggest damage is done to us when we're lulled into a sense of complacency. To a certain extent, that's what happened with Gaza as well. There was a sense of complacency and accepting a quiet. And I think that talking about the risks of the extreme ideologies faced by certain Islamist groups is an important part of that. And I think talking about anti-Semitism amongst ourselves and recognizing its danger is important. I would hope that other groups around the world outside of our own echo chamber will also take these conversations seriously and understand why they continue to be so relevant.
But as you've pointed out many times, October 7th almost caused the opposite from happening, right? It seems to have caused more anti-Semitism, right? We're now the new Nazis. The Israelis are the new Nazis. So in many ways, it's just causing the opposite.
Right. I think that we were all somewhat taken aback by how quickly the anti-Semitism erupted on October 8th. Dara Horn says people like dead Jews, and so you would have thought that at the end of October 7th, we would have been very, very popular people. And yet it took just a blink of an eye for all of this anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism to erupt all over the world. And I think that it's evidence of the fact that it was always there. It was latent, it was existent there, and someone just had to sort of press a button and it all came out. Right. And frankly, if we're going to talk about Holocaust history, the same could be said in Germany as well. The Weimar Republic was a time when the Jews felt very comfortable in Germany, and I think many of them were surprised at the speed with which things erupted into the fore.
So you just used the word complacency, and I was going to make reference to what you just said about Jews perhaps feeling very complacent in Germany just prior to the Holocaust. So I'm wondering if we could get into the area, and many find this a sensitive area, that perhaps the same thing is going on around the world, but especially in the United States today, right? Jews have reached the top of society. They're captains of industry. They're lawyers. They're doctors. And in many ways, you and I both grew up in America. We thought that Jews had made it in America. But now we're seeing the anti-Semitism has really cropped up, especially on the college campuses since October 7th, but certainly in many other places as well. So can a lesson, or maybe even an action item, like I said before, of the Holocaust, be that we have to be a little bit more on guard against what's happening in every country, but today, certainly in the United States? And I'm not necessarily saying that that means that everyone should make Aliyah tomorrow. That's a different discussion. Forget about what people should do about it. I'm just talking about recognizing that it's there and recognizing that something needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, again, October 7th was violence directed towards us in Israel, and so it's not clear where we're ever going to be immune from anti-Semitic violence. And again, I would consider the violence on October 7th in the South to be anti-Semitic violence. And anti-Semitism is everywhere. You know, it's easy, whether it's in Teaneck or it's in Kfar Aza or if it's in Paris, it's there. And frankly, oftentimes that's very depressing. I'm not sure exactly what can be done as an action item, but I'll leave it to the rabbis in the room.
Well, it's not necessarily the rabbis. It's the heads of many of these major Holocaust or anti-Semitism bodies, like the ADL, right? The Anti-Defamation League. The head of the ADL basically spoke a few days ago, maybe it was last week, and more or less said that everything that this industry of being against anti-Semitism has done has basically been a failure. So much money has been spent on that industry, so to speak. So it really makes you wonder what can, if anything, can be done about anti-Semitism. You talked about living in a micro world. So maybe in a micro world, it could be worked on and maybe people can succeed. Talking about on a macro level, the entire world seems to be a very, very, very big challenge. You said before or that the Holocaust is unique, and that's a bedrock of Holocaust education. And we said we were going to get back to that. Now, while that is true, right, it's essentially incomparable, right? You've also noted how many aspects of October 7th have been deeply triggering. You've used that word, triggering, and I think it's an excellent word, and not necessarily just for Holocaust survivors who've spoken about the sounds of terrorists going from door to door, or the separation of families, or the smoke from burning homes, but even those people who didn't experience the Holocaust directly, because this has been so embedded in our psyche that when these things happen, it triggers certain things, even if we or the people that are experiencing them were not directly affected by the Holocaust. So can you help us understand these echoes, these triggers, so to speak, and why they resonate so powerfully across all generations, but especially for us now?
I think that some of it has to do with an important lesson which Rabbi Sachs taught us, which is that for Jewish people, history is memory. And he spoke about the fact that there is no biblical Hebrew word for history. There's a word zachor, which is memory. And that the distinction between the two is that it's not a dispassionate study from afar, but rather when the Jews learn about what happened to their people in the past, it's something which they absorb into themselves. And the entire spiral of Jewish history is kind of embedded within all of us, and that we experience it as ourselves, just like at the Pesach Seder, Ke'ilu Yatzam min Mitzrayim, just as if we went out of Mitzrayim. And I think that many of us, whether we're the children of survivors or we're just people who've been part of the Jewish educational world, really feel the Holocaust in a very visceral way as part of our personal history. And so when we say that we're triggered, it's not a falsehood and it's not an exaggeration. It's literally the fact that when we hear stories of children hiding in closets in a mamad in 2023, that it immediately evokes images of children hiding as Nazis rampage through Shtetlach trying to find Jews in a roundup. That's something which is an immediate association between the two. And again, these were things which were coming up immediately.
So can you give us some other examples besides Nazis searching for children in closets?
there were the images, first of all, the images of the sexual violence, of the Nova participants racing through the streets. There are some very famous images of Jewish women running after their clothes had been ripped off of them in Lvov in 1941. And those images of racing from immediate sexual violence or the threat thereof, those were things which were very, very triggering. This idea, again, of children, there are reports from down south of children who knew to be quiet when the Hamasnikim were marauding through the homes. And Rav Lau has discussed the poignancy of Jewish children during the Shoah knowing instinctively that they could not cry out and that they had to be silent. And a sort of maturity and an understanding. So those are some important connections. The whole notion of Jews being hunted in their homes as opposed to conflicts occurring between two different sets of soldiers really brings us back to the Shoah. And again, I'm not sure if this is something you want to go to, but there are also elements of the resistance and ways in which we responded to this tragedy, which were also evocative of the period of the Shoah. When we heard stories about Elchanan Kalmanson, who went from door to door to save people out of their mamads in Be'eri, and that the people inside were skeptical as to whether it was really someone to save them who was on the other side, and that he repeated the Shema as a password to that they would understand that it was safe to open the door. Again, these are stories which are almost copy paste out of the Shoah. The notion of the Shema being a password is very much in the Shoah. And again, and then there are certain images, the images of piles of shoes from Nova victims. I mean, I don't have to say much. I think anyone who is familiar at all with Holocaust Remembrance knows how prominent shoes are in terms of all the shoes which were collected in Majdanek and appear in all sorts of museums as representative of the masses of the lost.
So again, you're saying that there's the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but obviously there are many differences, many similarities rather, in terms of how things were carried out. I want to go back to this idea of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. I know we've touched upon it several times, but I still have a problem understanding it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think it's just a Talmudic debate. And what I mean by that is, what's so bad if we say that this is similar to the Holocaust? Meaning, what will it take away something from the Holocaust? We all know maybe it's not historically accurate, but beyond historical accuracy, what would be so bad about comparing something to the Holocaust?
Well, first of all, I think there's something bad about I think there's something essential about historical accuracy, and I think that historical accuracy is not just a Talmudic, esoteric kind of debate for people in the universities to debate. I think that we're on an assault on the truth everywhere, even more so, and with each passing decade, as we get further from the historical event, and Holocaust denial is more and more pernicious. I think the notion of sticking to historical accuracy is essential.
So you've taught me my lesson. I agree. I can't believe I even
you walked into that one.
I can't say I even I disagree. Obviously, I'm a historian in many ways myself, and so therefore you're 100%. I take that back. But let me try a different way. Meaning the Hamas terrorists that brutally murdered somebody in Kfar Aza, right? And the Nazi who shot somebody in Ponar Forest outside of Vilna, they were both thinking the same exact thing. Maybe not the same exact thing, but the amount of hatred and the amount of anti-Semitism, in my mind, was identical. So at the end of the day, why can't you make comparisons? Okay, you're right about historical accuracy, but will it really do all that much damage to make a comparison like that?
Well, one of the questions is, what are you gaining from the comparison? In other words, the fact that what happened down south and the violence and the hatred is reminiscent and perhaps even equal to some of the hatred that existed during the Shoah. Okay, so maybe certain aspects of it were very similar. The events still are more dissimilar than they are similar. You want to say that the hatred now is equivalent to the hatred then? I don't know. In other words, I don't have a thermometer for hatred. And even if we say that the hatred now is more than the hatred then, let's just take that as so then I'm not sure what we really accomplished. We're suffering now. The Jewish people suffered in October, and it will take us a very, very long time to recover from what happened, if we ever recover fully. And I think that at a certain point, it's important to analyze each event on its own legs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We said that we would turn to this later. We've spoken a lot about the Holocaust, October 7th through the prism of the Holocaust. Now I want to speak about it in the opposite direction. So in 40 years, right, because you spoke about the fact that it's right in the middle of the event and it's hard to really analyze. You spoke about that at the beginning, and it's certainly true. It's hard to write history or to decide how to educate while the event is still happening. But in 40 years, when Israeli children are learning in school about the Holocaust, will they have to take October 7th into account? What will change about Holocaust history because of October 7th?
I don't know. I don't know that October 7th will be part of the train of Holocaust history, or perhaps it'll be more in the course of Israeli history and the changes which happened then. And again, and as we've said, we still don't know the end of this event. And so that will also indicate how it's taught in the classroom. I think that the events of October 7th are very important even today in terms of how we study the Holocaust, because I think it helps us reappreciate certain aspects of the Holocaust. In other words, we all talk about the fact that the numbers of the Holocaust are incomprehensible, and there are all sorts of, from paper clips which are collected, all different methods that educators try to put into action to help people understand the enormity of the Shoah. For me, I felt the enormity of the Shoah on October 8th, 9th, 10th, as the numbers of that massacre were coming out. And I was watching on my iPhone the numbers rise from 350, 400, 450. And then at a certain point, I'm not very good with numbers, but I do know one number from the Shoah, and that is Babi Yar. And in Babi Yar, in 2 days, 33,771 people were murdered. And when I thought about what I was going through and the sorrow and the feeling of trauma from what we were going through, and then I thought about those much larger numbers, I just didn't know how to go back and truly understand those numbers. And so again, Khalila, that I'm trying to minimize the numbers of what we're going through now. But I think that going through what we've gone through in the last year and a half, I think we can now revisit the Holocaust and start to again peel away and understand its enormity.
So I want to push you a little bit more. You said Khalila, but I want to push you. I know that you don't think this, but I'm going to suggest it anyway. It could sound from what you're saying that perhaps we should not feel as bad for 1,200 people that get killed on October 7th as we do for the 33,000 and some odd in Babi Yar. Meaning, again, what's the... Okay, I understand the historical accuracy, but what, in terms of our emotions, in terms of our feelings, right? You were talking about looking at your phone on October 7th. On October 7th, while you were looking at your phone, I doubt very much that you were thinking about historical accuracy, right? So what are you saying?
I'm saying that I was flipping back and forth. In other words, my mind, because I'm someone who thinks about the Shoah often and reads about it often, and I'm always steeped in these different facts, it was hard for me to process what was going on around me without also thinking about the Holocaust as well. I don't know as much about the Chmelnytsky massacres. I don't know as much about the Spanish Inquisition. And I would venture to say that if we took out, I once did this actually, if you took out certain eduyot, certain testimonies and writings from those various historical events, many of them would map very clearly the Kishinev pogrom with what happened down south. But my well of knowledge, which I was drawing on, my memories, which I were drawing drawing on in the broadest sense were Holocaust memories. And so when I was processing October 7th, I was thinking about the Shoah, and when I look back at the Shoah now, I feel even smaller in my understanding. I feel more humble in my lack of understanding of the enormity of the Shoah, because of the enormity. And of course, it goes without saying, and I know that you agree with me on this, that each person is olam umlo'o. In other words, you can't compare numbers. If you lost one person, it doesn't matter if they were 1 in 33,000 or 1 in 200. It doesn't matter what the number. It's your one, and your whole world has been shattered. And I think that that's how we as Jews also process each loss one by one. But again, having lived through the trauma of October 7th, I looked back at the Shoah and I felt even more ill-equipped to understand the enormity of it.
There's one huge difference between the Shoah and October 7th, which we haven't said yet, but is always lurking behind the scenes. And that is, we now live in the modern state of Israel, which obviously did not exist in the times of the Shoah. We have an army. Both of us are parents of soldiers, right? Obviously, that's a major difference. So what do you think about that?
I think that it's the ultimate difference. And here I'm speaking as myself, not as a Holocaust educator. There's the official position that different Holocaust educators can take, but for me personally, the notion that now we're able to defend ourselves is not lost on me. The truth is that I felt it even before October 7th. If you ask my kids, I've done a terrible thing to them, but I've burdened them with very, very long names on their Teudat Zehut. And my son Avi is burdened with the name Avram Abba Malina Waxman on his Teudat Zehut because my grandfather, who was the sole survivor of his family, was Avram Abba Malina. And when I saw his choger and it had that full thing, Avram Abba Malina Waxman, it was tremendously meaningful to me that the namesake for my grandfather, if only he could know that his name was going out to defend the Jewish people, I think that it would have been simultaneously unbelievable and incredible. I like to think it would also bring him great pride.
I think we all have moments like that, only in Israel moments. That's very moving. I think there are many people who feel like if only this person who died in the Holocaust, if only this person who's no longer living, but a dream of the state of Israel was dreamt, that they would just feel on a very, very big high. But here I want to push you as well, because we know that one of the strongest arguments for the creation of the state of Israel was a place for Jews to be safe, a place for Jews to be defended. And yes, we do have a strong army. And yes, we've made it. We've done more than make it. We've always succeeded, despite the ups and downs. But one could claim that the state of Israel is perhaps the most dangerous place for Jews today. So what are we doing wrong?
Look, the state of Israel failed on October 7th. I don't think that that's an overly political thing to say. I think that that's a statement of fact. I think that what we saw in the wake of October 7th, though, again, if we want to talk about comparisons to the Shoah, the grassroots assumption of responsibility, the grassroots help from one group to another, these were things which happened. We talk about informal leadership, which was taking the reins during the Shoah. People who previously were not communal leaders, but who found the strength to then lead people to safety. We can think about the Bielskis and others. People who weren't the great leaders beforehand, but who found their moment to save and care for other Jews. I think we saw the same thing happen immediately after October 7th, a tremendous feeling of solidarity. Halavai, if only that a sort of sense of solidarity were to continue. Again, and just as there was complacency, we talked earlier, we used that word abroad. I think there was complacency within the establishment here, and hopefully the state of Israel is, I think it's clear. You look, the Middle East is, and this here I'm really beyond my bailiwick, but the Middle East it has been reordered, and hopefully we will never be caught flat-footed again.
Amen to that. I want to tell you two experiences that I had about this overall topic and just get your feelings about them. So one of them was I was at Nova. I bring a lot of groups down south, and I was at Nova. And one of the people that was with me, a pretty influential person, said, "This is the new Auschwitz," right? And additionally, I had another experience which was similar. that Iris Chaim, the mother of a hostage that unfortunately got killed by our own forces, she spoke in our shul last week, and she was saying that, and I think very correctly so, that he was a hero. Why was he a hero? Because he escaped. He was able to escape the Hamas terrorists, and no matter whether he got killed at the end, obviously that's a big difference, but despite the fact that he got killed, that means that he is a hero, which I agree with 100%, and I don't think anyone would disagree with. But when she spoke about him, she said, oh, I see him as a partisan, right? So this idea that Nova was the new Auschwitz, he was a partisan. So despite the fact that it should be incomparable, people are using these symbols, they're using these ideas, they're using these words. So is there something we should be doing about that in order to maintain the uniqueness of the Holocaust, or should we just, let it go? Obviously, with Iris Chaim, you have to let it go, but...
Well, Iris Chaim can say whatever she
right,
would like.
Exactly.
And I'm certainly not going to be a language police or a thought police, and I think that to the extent that people... speak in certain ways, everyone has to speak in a way that suits them and expresses themselves.
Right, and God forbid, I'm not criticizing anybody.
No.
Well, not for saying anything. Anyone could say whatever they want, and like you said, she could certainly say whatever she wants. But I'm talking about it in the way that people think, right? She thought of him as a partisan, and a partisan is from the Holocaust, and yet we have soldiers, right? We have an army. And so it just seemed interesting to me.
Right. Well, I think that actually the comparison to a partisan is very, very apt in terms of somebody who's not officially part of the army, but who is taking on an active role for survival, for revenge or whatever it is. I think that perhaps she was touching on something which is much broader and which is a lesson that we learned in decades after the Shoah. The immediate period right after the Shoah, the notion of heroism was defined very narrowly, and it was defined to include primarily the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and other moments when people did not, quote unquote, with that terrible maligning, going like sheep to the slaughter. And in later decades, there was a more Jewish-centered telling of history, which broadened the understanding of heroism to include religious heroism and cultural heroism and the heroism of just staying alive and the heroism of a mother keeping their child safe, etc. That much broader understanding. And I think that perhaps is one of the best things that we can take from our studies of the Holocaust, and that would be to understand the notion of heroism broadly. My son-in-law, I'm proud that he served in Gaza, and I'm also very proud of my daughter for the way that she held up the house at home. And I think that they're both heroes. And so I think the notion of spreading the notion, the understanding heroism in all of its multifaceted ways, that's something that we learned in the later historiography of the Shoah, and I think that that's something that we can adopt today.
So just give us an example. You mentioned cultural heroism, spiritual heroism, religious heroism. I'm not sure that everyone really understands what that is. So religious heroism, can you just give us one example?
Okay, during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there were those who were not appropriate fighters, but they stayed in their bunker, Rav Meisel's among them, and held a Pesach Seder. What does it mean to hold on to Jewish tradition in the face of bombs exploding outside, to hold on to our traditions when it seems that it would be worthless, or that there is no future? What's the point in still holding on to that? That would be a good example of religious resistance. I'll note that we had in real time reports of that sort of resistance happening by Alex Danzig in the tunnels of Gaza, that he was sharing lessons on Jewish history with other hostages. A hostage who was released reported on his ability to do that. And I think that that's copy-paste again, straight out of the Shoah, the notion that you could be sitting underground in a Hamas tunnel and still hold on to your wits, and still see the purpose in engaging in the study of history. I think that that's a heroism which is just beyond comprehension.
It's amazing. It's amazing. It is incomprehensible. I just want to tell you one more experience that I had, and then we'll conclude. I am a member of the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America. I live in Israel, but when I was in America, I was a member, and there are several hundred members of the RCA here in Israel who, rabbis who made Aliyah. And at the beginning of the war, in November at some point, a bunch of missions started coming, right? And so there were a bunch of rabbis from the RCA. They came, they had 6 different missions. And because of my cooperation in a number of ways between my organization, Barkai, and the RCA, I went on every single one of the missions. So in the first mission, we're sitting sort of at the beginning, getting to know each other and being told what we're going to do. And a young rabbi from America speaks up and says, "It's amazing to me here. I thought, and I think we all thought in America, that everyone was cowering down and was afraid, wasn't going out of their homes. And yet, when I came to Israel, I see that people feel a great pride. People feel like things are really happening, that inspirational things are happening, even amidst the tragedy. We're not ignoring the tragedy, but there are a lot of wonderful things happening because of the war for Israeli society." Now, it would seem to me, you're the expert, not me, but it would seem to me that this is a major difference between October 7th and the Holocaust. Yes, there were efforts to save people and there were efforts to maintain Jewish life, but what we've seen in Israel today, I think, has just been nothing short of unbelievable. And as that rabbi said, in many ways, at least at the beginning, it was largely unknown to people outside of the state of Israel.
Yeah, I think that perhaps I think that I'll just say one more thing. I'll say that that perhaps one of the best lessons that we can draw from the Shoah is the extent to which Jews after the Shoah, survivors after the Shoah, despite all odds, were able to rebuild their lives. And I think that the resilience which you're pointing to, which this RCA rabbi noted, I think that resilience is something which is very much related to the resilience of the survivors afterwards, and in that sense, it I think can fill us all with hope and pride, with tikva that Bezrat Hashem we will be able to rebuild.
The resilience that you're mentioning now, in many ways, I'm thinking, is very similar to the heroism that you were talking about earlier.
Absolutely. In other words, there's resilience within the war context, and eventually, Bezrat Hashem, when the war ends and we have to rebuild completely afterwards, it's happening kind of as in process as this is going on. There's rebuilding and war happening simultaneously. I think that's some of what this rabbi was noting. But eventually, when we can declare this event to have been over, I think that we will still have to pick up many pieces. And I think that the models of so many people after the Shoah who went on to accomplish great things afterwards can really be role models for us and inspiration for us.
Amen. I think that that's a very good place to end. But if you have any last thoughts.
That's great. That's
okay.
great.
Well,
Amen.
I think we learned a lot about, and we spoke a lot about both the uniqueness of the Holocaust, but also some of the similarities, but more importantly, what we can learn from each thing. And hopefully, like I said before, in terms of action items, I'm not sure, both of us said we're not sure what the action items are, but hopefully we could use each event in order to make this world a better place.
Amen.
Thank you for joining me on Defining Moments. Remember to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star rating and a review. Please share this podcast with your friends who, like you, want to be inspired both by this period in Jewish and Israeli history and by the people who are making these defining moments happen. Let's not squander this unique opportunity. Maybe the next defining moment will be created by you or me. Until next time, I'm Rabbi David Fine.